Welcome to my second lecture on myth criticism. Today, we're going to examine Carl Jung's theories as well as Joseph Campbell's. Many of Jung's concepts have established themselves in the collective unconscious, to use one of the Swiss psychologist's most famous ideas. Jung, who preferred to call himself an analytical psychologist, also introduced personality traits such as introvert and extrovert, the notion of the feminine and masculine sides of the human psyche, the shadow or dark side, a description of archetypal figures, some of them picked up by George Lucas in his Star Wars movies. Initially, Jung followed Freud's theories, introducing also some of Nietzsche's ideas on the irrational Dionysian dark side to the human mind, ruled by sometimes uncontrolled emotions and opposed to the Apollinian side of the conscious rationality and light. Nietzsche's ideas appear in his 1872 volume, The Birth of Tragedy. Jung believed that elements of the rejected dark side, that he termed shadow, could be projected onto the outside world, channeled against other human beings in the form of frustrations, violence, and war. Only if humans were capable of accepting and controlling these irrational elements, they would be free of destruction. It is interesting to recall William Butler Yeats's poem The Second Coming in this context. Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart. The center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosened upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosened, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand. The second coming, hardly are those words out, when a vast image out of Spiritus Mundi troubles my sight. Somewhere in sands of the desert, a shape with lion body and the head of a man, a gaze blank and pitiless as the sun, is moving its slow thighs, while all about it reel shadows of the indignant desert birds. The darkness drops again, but now I know that 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to nightmare by a rocking candle. And what rough beast its hour come round at last, slouches towards Bethlehem to be born. From the beginning of times, dreams have been interpreted as prophetic instruments. In the oldest preserved myth, the 4,000-year-old Sumerian epic of Gilgamesh, goddess named Sun, mother of the hero, interprets one of her son's dreams in which stars have fallen down on him. He is worried because the stars remain as his companions and cannot be removed. The following is a quote from The Archetypes of the Collective Unconscious by Carl Jung. Since the stars have fallen from heaven and our highest symbols have paled, a secret life holds sway in the unconscious. That is why we have psychology today, and why we speak of the unconscious. All this would be quite superfluous in an age of culture that possesses symbols. Symbols are a spirit from above, and under those conditions, their spirit is above too. Our unconscious hides living water, a spirit that has become nature, and that's why it is disturbed. Heaven has become for us the cosmic space of the physicist and the divine empyrean affair memory of things that once were. But the heart glows, and a secret unrest gnaws at the roots of our being. Jung was born in Switzerland. His father was a rural pastor, and the family lived at Kleinhüningen clergy house. At a very early age, Jung learned to escape from an oppressive family environment. He believed that his grandfather, the physician Carl Gustav Jung, was the illegitimate son of Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. This fantasy inspired his lifelong enthusiasm for Goethe's works, especially Faust. Jung also admired the pre-Socratics, Plato, the medieval mysticism of Meister Eckhart, the philosophies of Immanuel Kant, Arthur Schopenhauer, and in particular Friedrich Nietzsche. Enthralled by spiritualism and the occult, around 1896, Jung devoured the works of Emanuel Swedenborg, the arcane works of Gnostics and mystics, and the alchemical, astrological, and spiritual writings of Paracelsus, all of which foreshadowed Goethe's Faust and Nietzsche's Zarathustra. Like his grandfather, Jung studied medicine at the University of Basel and discovered he had a passion for psychiatry. After his father's early death, the family was supported by relatives. Jung worked on a dissertation which was published in 1903 under the title On the Psychology and Pathology of the So-Called Occult Phenomena. For 9 years, he was assistant physician at the famous Burgosli Psychiatric Hospital in Zurich, where he studied schizophrenia under Eugen Bleuler. In 1903, Jung married Emma Rauschenbach, who would take considerable interest in her husband's work and became his assistant and eventually a psychoanalyst herself. During his marriage, Jung engaged in extramarital relationships. Eventually, he had an affair with Sabina Spielrein, a Russian aristocrat who was first a patient and later became the first female psychoanalyst. Jung was introduced to Freud writing when asked to write a review on the interpretation of dreams, which Freud had recently published in 1899. A few years later, in 1907, Jung went to Vienna to meet Freud. They collaborated for some time and exchanged many letters. 2 years later, in 1909, they both traveled to the USA to a conference. That same year, Jung left his work at the hospital and began a private practice in his home in Küsnacht. Jung and Freud met for the last time in September 1913 for the 4th International Psychoanalytical Congress in Munich. Jung gave a talk on psychological types, the introverted and extroverted types in analytical psychology. A few years before, in 1912, while working on psychology of the unconscious, a study of the transformations and symbolisms of the libido, tensions had manifested between him and Freud, and their personal and professional relationship fractured. Jung felt Freud was too narrow-minded about his views on the unconscious and dream interpretation. Freud's main theories were that sexual libido controlled human consciousness and that dreams expose the hidden sexual desires and drives. Jung preferred the idea of dreams staging forms of psychic energy. He also thought that dreams contained parallels with myths that showed universal traits, which he set out to discover by means of what he termed analytic psychology. While Freud believed in personal unconscious, containing individual repressed subliminal memories, Jung formulated the existence of a transpersonal collective unconscious, which retained elements of previous communal life, family, tribe, and larger human groups. This collective unconscious manifested itself not only in dreams but also in common and recurrent myths and primordial images that he termed archetypes. He believed the most important archetype, the self, was divided in a little self, an ego with a limited view, and a big self with access to the deepest unconsciousness of the mind, and which included also collective aspects of our previous divine nature. The following is a quote from Jung regarding the nature of dreams. Dreams were the original guidance of man in the great darkness. When a man is in the wilderness, darkness brings the dreams that guide him. It has always been so. I have not been led by any kind of wisdom. I've been led by dreams, like any primitive. When you are in the darkness, you take the next thing, and that is a dream. And you can be sure that the dream is your nearest friend. The dream is the friend of those who are not guided anymore by the traditional truth, and in consequence are isolated. Initially, Jung aligned with Freud regarding the division of dreams into three classes, representing number one, an unrepressed wish in an undisguised form, the infantile type. Number two, the fulfillment of a repressed wish in disguised form, and most dreams belong to this type. Number three, a repressed wish in undisguised form, often accompanied by fear. As for the purpose or function of dreams in general, Jung, in agreement with Freud, articulates succinctly that dreams are a facade for the preservation of sleep and represent the guardian of sleep. However, in relation to language, while Freud conceived dreams as primary process thinking, sexual drives censured by the intrusion of the superego, Jung believed that rather than conceal, dreams sought to reveal. He thought that they held a compensatory function directed to correcting biases of the conscious mind. To Jung, dreams had a prospective orientation by simultaneously looking inwards. Dreams are often anticipatory and would lose their specific meaning completely on a purely causalistic view, he mentioned. However, while Freud used free association to interpret dreams, Jung was also critical of this method and pointed out that it always went back to childhood and to neurotic complexes. Jung believed in a method he called amplification, which entailed circling around a dream image by means of a growing number of free associations, first personal and functional, later leading to greater historical, and finally archetypal in comparative perspective. Amplification followed from his belief on different levels of meaning, objective versus subjective. The process relies on the active imagination of the mind, which dialogues with the dream elements and its concrete expressions in artistic representations. The ultimate layer transcends personal meanings and individual consciousness to reach universal archetypes. The following is a quote from Jung. The dream is a little hidden door in the innermost and most secret recesses of the soul, opening into the cosmic night, which was psyche long before there was any ego consciousness, and which remained psyche no matter how far ego consciousness extends. In 1921, Jung published Psychological Types, a book which included his perspective on personality traits and the degrees of openness contributing to the two psychological attitudes, introversion and extroversion. He theorized that in introversion, consciousness flows inward, that is subjective, and in extroversion it flows outward, objective. According to Jung, an extrovert seeks intensive contact with the outside world. An introvert instead turns to the psychic energy inwards. The introvert is someone who keeps to his or herself and is emotionally self-sufficient. The extrovert is outgoing and uses their psychological power to draw people towards them. These types correspond to the ancient archetypes, Apollo and Dionysus, the two aspects Nietzsche had explored in The Birth of Tragedy. The introvert is likened to Apollo, who shines light on understanding, focuses on the internal world of reflection, dream, and inner sight, sometimes uninterested in joining the activities of others. The extrovert is associated with Dionysus, interested in joining the activities of the world, sensory perception, and action. Aligned with the two psychological attitudes, introversion and extroversion, Jung posited four functions: thinking, feeling, sensation, and intuition. By nature, introverted people have a higher level of brain activity and intuition. Therefore, they feel a greater need to shield themselves from external stimuli. While withdrawing themselves, they gain more mental energy. On the other hand, the neural activity of extroverts is lower. They overcome this lack by exposing themselves to external stimulation and sensation. Jung believed that no one is 100% extrovert or 100% introvert. Instead, we carry both traits. However, most minds tend to lean either to one side or the other. Most of the most important Jungian concepts are described in analytical psychology, theory and practice. The evolution of his science is contained in his monumental opus, The Collected Works, written over 60 years of his lifetime. The general aim of Jungian psychology is what he called the individuation process, a process by which the individual is helped to harmonize his or her persona, that is, the self is presented as to the world, and the shadow, the darker, potentially dangerous side of the personality that exists in the personal unconscious. Jung said, the self, like the unconscious, is an a priori existence out of which the ego evolves. It is an unconscious prefiguration of the ego. It is not I who create myself, rather I happen to myself. One example of the failure in the individuation process is represented, for example, in Robert Louis Stevenson's famous story, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, in which Dr. Jekyll is the persona and Mr. Hyde is the shadow. Unlike Freud, Jung did not believe that the work of an artist represented his personal psychology. Instead, Jung thought that it was the representation of the relationship between the personal and the collective unconscious. This collective unconscious is common to the whole human race and contains universal archetypes. The term archetype comes from Greek via Latin, and it means first molded. Thus, it refers to an original pattern. The origins of the archetypal hypothesis date as far back as Plato. Plato's ideas formulated the hypothesis of an eidos, where pure mental forms were later imprinted in the human soul before it was born into the world. Jung described the archetype as, and I quote, the formulated meaning of a primordial image by which it was represented symbolically. Thus, archetypes are primordial images revealed in dreams, artistic and literary productions, in primitive religions, and in myths. The following is a quote from Jung. These primordial images or archetypes, as I have called them, belong to the basic stock of the unconscious psyche and cannot be explained as personal acquisitions. Together, they make up the psychic stratum which it has been called the collective unconscious. The existence of the collective unconscious means that individual consciousness is anything but a tabula rasa and is not immune to predetermining influences. On the contrary, it is in the biggest degree influenced by inherited presuppositions, quite apart from the unavoidable influences exerted upon it by the environment. The collective unconscious comprises in itself the psychic life of our ancestors right back to the earliest beginnings. It is the matrix of all conscious psychic occurrences, and hence it exerts an influence that compromises the freedom of consciousness in the highest degree. Jung's theory divides the psyche into three parts. The first is the ego, which Jung identifies with the conscious mind, where perceptions, memories, and thoughts happen. This part is responsible for feeling, identity, and continuity. Closely related is the personal unconscious, which includes anything which is not presently conscious, but can be. The personal unconscious is like most people's understanding of the unconscious in that it includes both memories that are easily brought to mind and also those that have been suppressed for some reason. The individuation process is an autonomous process of accomplishing individual wholeness, experienced as a psychological completeness. In Jung's terms, individuation means the realization of the self, which is the conjunction of the conscious and the unconscious. The first step is the assimilation of the shadow. It means the acknowledgement of these moral deficiencies as being part of our own personality. The trickster is an archetypal figure, embodiment of the undifferentiated consciousness of the primitive man coming from his identification with animals. It can be equated sometimes with the shadow. The second step is the confrontation with the anima and animus. It is symbolized by the inner marriage, coming to terms with the inner male and female and with parts of our personality. The third step is the encounter with the archetype of the wise old man or woman. This image embraces our inborn wisdom, the meaning of life, the significance of our divine origin. And the end of the individuation process can be signaled through the vision of the mandala, which are like diagrams that symbolize the complete self, the psychic wholeness. As mentioned, Jung distinguishes between personal unconscious and collective unconscious. The personal unconscious involves experiences that were once conscious but have been suppressed, repressed, forgotten, or they are too weak to make a conscious impression. The persona is the social mask or appearance one presents to the world. Another concept is that of neurosis, which results from the buildup of psychological defenses the individual unconsciously musters in an effort to cope with perceived attacks from the outside world. Complexes are repressed organized group or constellations of psychic elements grouped around emotionally sensitive areas. And he categorizes in relation to functions, as we will see later. There is a nuclear element and there is a cluster of associations attached to the nucleus. Often the nucleus is a deep unconscious wound. The archetypal image often forms the nucleus of a complex, according to Jung. The shadow is an unconscious complex defined as the repressed, suppressed, or disowned qualities of the conscious self. In analytical psychology, he distinguishes between psychological temperaments, introversion and extroversion, and in turn, he aligns them with four functions: thinking, feeling, sensation, and intuition. Thinking is the comprehending, of the nature of the world. Feeling, so it's the rational aspect. Feeling assigns values and is also rational. Sensation has to do with perceptual representations and is irrational. And intuition is a form of perception by means of unconscious processes and subliminal content, and is also irrational. Let us recapitulate. We have the ego, the personal unconscious, and the collective unconscious. The collective unconscious is inherited from ancestral collective past and includes pre-human predispositions. It encompasses primordial images or archetypes that represent various aspects. There are some experiences that show the effects of this collective unconscious more clearly than others. The experiences of love at first sight, of déjà vu, the feeling that you've lived and experienced before, and the immediate recognition of certain symbols and myths, all of which can be understood as the sudden conjunction of our outer reality and the inner reality of the collective unconscious. Other examples are the creative experiences shared by artists, the spiritual experiences of mystics, dreams, fantasies, and of course, as we have mentioned, myths. A nice example that has been greatly discussed recently in the is the near-death experience. It seems that many people from very different cultural backgrounds find that they have very similar recollections when they are brought back from a close encounter with death. They speak of leaving their bodies, seeing their bodies and events surrounding them clearly, and being pulled through a long tunnel towards a bright light. They also speak of seeing deceased relatives or sometimes religious figures waiting for them, and they feel disappointed when having to leave this happy scene and return to their bodies when brought back to life after an operation or an accident or something like this. The term archetype comes from Greek, archt, beginning, origin, cause, primal source, principle, and also signifies the position of leadership, supreme rule. In other words, a kind of dominant. The second element in the word is type, which means blow. It comes from typon, means blow, the imprint also of something. In other words, the form, the image, a prototype, a model. And if in the figurative modern sense, it could also be like a pattern. The content of the collective unconscious are the archetypes. Jung called them dominants, imagos. He also called them mythological, primordial images. These archetypes determine the form and function of human representations, particularly in art, literary works, and other processes where unconscious elements are more obvious. While emergent representations are apprehended consciously, the archetypes that inform them are unconscious, and they are impossible to apprehend. These representations themselves are not inherited. Only the original primordial images are inherited. And it is in this respect that they correspond to primordial instincts, as Freud would have it. One of the most important archetypes is that of the animus, anima. The animus is a woman's archetypal image of a man, and the anima is the man's archetypal image of a woman. The animus often appears as a wise old man, and the anima as a mother goddess. The archetype unfolds through a program sequence, which Jung called the stages of life. Each stage of life is mediated through a new set of archetypal imperatives which seek fulfillment in action. This may include being parented, initiation, courtship, marriage, preparation for death, etc. Often, archetypes correspond to figures of transition, representing a rite of passage from one stage of life to the next. Thus, Jung explains that, and I quote, the concept of archetype has a fluid core. Strictly speaking, archetypal figures such as the hero, the goddess, and the wise man are not archetypes but archetypal images, which have crystallized out of the archetypes as such. The archaic remnants, which I call archetypes or primordial images. He goes on to speak of the self. For Jung, the self is the most important archetype and represents the ultimate unity of the personality, the male and the female part, perfection, completion, and it's usually symbolized by a circle, sometimes the cross, or sometimes the mandala figures that Jung was very fond of painting. What is a mandala? Well, a mandala is a drawing that is used in meditation because it tends to draw focus back to the center. And it can be as simple as a geometric figure, but also it can also take very complicated forms. The personifications that best represent the self are famous mystics and religious figures such as Christ and Buddha, for example, to people who achieved perfection. Jung felt that perfection of the personality it's only achieved after death. And the following is another quote from Jung. It is the archetype of wholeness and the regulating center of the psyche, a transpersonal power that transcends the ego. He's referring to the self. The self holds all other systems together and provides equilibrium and stability. It becomes evident in middle age, according to Jung, and he believed that this is because the center of personality migrates from the ego to, and I quote, a focal point between conscious and unconscious, and the personality gets a more solid foundation. As we shall see, Jung's conception of archetypes influenced Joseph Campbell's monomyth theory. He also influenced French philosopher of science Gaston Bachelard in his Poetics of Rêverie in 1960. But let us look at some of Jung's concepts in greater detail. As we have mentioned, the persona appears as a consciously created personality or identity, fashioned out of part of the collective psyche through socialization, acculturation, and experience. It is the face we present to the world. In Latin, the term means both personality and the mask worn by Roman actors of the classical period, expressive of the individual roles they played. The persona, Jung argued, is a mask for the collective psyche, a mask that pretends individuality so that both the self and others believe in that identity, even if it is really no more than a well-played role through which the collective psyche is expressed. Jung regarded the persona mask as a complicated system which mediates between individual consciousness and the social community. At its best, the persona is just the good impression we all wish to present as we feel the role society requires. But of course, it can also be the false impression we use to manipulate people's opinions and behaviors. And at its worst, it can be mistaken, even by ourselves, for our true nature. Sometimes we believe we really are what we pretend to be. The therapist assists the patient's individuation process through which he or she regains his or her own self. by liberating the self both from the deceptive cover of the persona and from the excessive power of unconscious impulses, the shadow. Jung believed that this journey of transformation, which he called, as we have mentioned, individuation, it's at the mystical heart of all religions. To Jung, this is a journey to meet the self and at the same time to meet the divine. The shadow resembles Freud, id, and Lacan's imaginary. It refers to aspects of the personal and conscious which the conscious ego does not identify in itself. It can also be everything of which a person is not fully conscious, the repressed side. If the persona refers to the outer mask of the personality, that which a person wishes to show to the world, the shadow represents those feared and unknown parts that the person chooses to hide, both from herself and from others. Thus, it is often included in aspects of personality which are considered negative. Positive aspects may also remain hidden in the case of people with low self-esteem, anxieties, or false beliefs. Awareness of the shadow is the first step in the process of individuation. According to Jung, and I quote, "To the degree to which the shadow is recognized and integrated, the problem of the anima, that is, of relationship, is constellated and becomes the center of the individuation quest." Symbols of the shadow include the snake, as in the Garden of Eden, the dragon, monsters, and often demons. It often guards the entrance to a cave or a pool of water which separates world dimensions. The shadow may be, in part, once linked to more primitive animal instincts, superseded in socialization in early childhood. It is instinctive, irrational, and prone to psychological projection, in which a perceived personal inferiority is recognized as a perceived moral deficiency in someone else, which more recent critical theory terms the other. Since the persona is a compromise between the individual and society, the more rigid our persona, the darker the shadow. The descent into darkness reincorporates the shadow into the personality, producing a stronger, wider consciousness than before. And this is, as I mentioned, the first stage of individuation. According to Jung, confrontation with the shadow produces at first a dead balance, a standstill that hampers moral decisions and makes convictions ineffective. Chaos, tenebrositas, melancholia. Dreams with negative, scary people of same gender may express shadow issues, according to Jung. He explains that the libido leaves the bright upper world, sinks back into its own depths, below in the shadows of the unconscious. However, Jung also describes the shadow as the seat of creativity. According to him, the shadow sometimes overwhelms a person's actions, for example, when the conscious mind is shocked, confused, or paralyzed by indecision. A man who is possessed by his shadow is always standing in his own light and falling into his own traps, says Jung. In terms of the story of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, it is Jekyll, the conscious side, the one that integrates the dark side. If this is not possible, he would become the slave of the unconscious shadow. And the following is another quote by Jung. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. Part of our persona is the role males and females must play in socialization. In all societies, the expectations placed on men and women differ. Traditionally, in primitive societies, based on reproductive roles, women were expected to be more nurturant and less aggressive, and men to be strong and ignore the emotional side of life. But Jung feels that these expectations meant that we had not developed our full potentials as selves. According to Jung, the anima is the female aspect present in the collective unconscious of men, and the animus is the male aspect present in the collective unconscious of women. The term anima originates from Latin to describe the soul, breath, and vital force. It's also the archetype responsible for the different types of love and relationships we experience in life. Jung thought that male sensitivity was often repressed and considered the anima as the expression of a complex, appearing in dreams and influencing a person's attitudes and interactions with other sex. The anima takes the form of an image, a female image present in dreams and the fantasies of man. Linked to the Eros principle, the anima reflects the nature of relationships, and Jung described it in 4 distinct levels, to which he gave female names: Eve, Helen, Mary, and Sophia, referring to different myths and mythical archetypal images. Hawa, or Eve, named after the Genesis account, refers to the primary biological impulses dealing with man's object of sexual desire, and it symbolizes physical sex and maternity reproduction. Helen refers to Helen of Troy in Greek mythology, when Heroes acquires external qualities such as self-reliance, intelligence, and these skills contribute to reach an aesthetic and also romantic level. Mary, named after Christian theological understanding of the Virgin Mary, represents virtue and a spiritual conjunction. And Sophia, the Greek word for wisdom, is the personification of completeness, both inner and external. Some typical anima figures are the white goddess, maternal figures, maidens, prostitutes, sometimes sorcerers, mermaids, but they can also take the form of contemporary famous women. Anima figures are not representations of specific women. They are archetypal figures of emotional experiences having to do with interrelational problems. According to Jung, every man carries within him the eternal image of woman, not the image of this or that particular woman, but a definite feminine image. This image is fundamentally unconscious, a hereditary factor of primordial origin engraved in the living organic system of the man, an imprint or archetype of all the ancestral experiences of the female, a deposit, as it were, of all the impressions ever made by woman. In short, an inherited system of psychic adaptation. Even if no women existed, it would still be possible at any given time to deduce them from this unconscious image, exactly how a woman would have to be constituted physically. The same is true of the woman. She too has her inborn image of man. And another quote: "The whole nature of man presupposes woman, both physically and spiritually. His system is tuned into woman from the start, just as it is prepared for a quite definite world where there is water, light, air, salt, carbohydrates, etc. The term animus originates from Latin, where it was used to describe ideas such as mental powers and reason, and it is the archetype of the masculine in the collective unconscious of woman, and describes the unconscious masculine aspects of feminine personality. It is linked to the logos principle, the discriminating, categorizing cognitive principle, as opposed to eros, which reflects the nature of the relation which appears in the anima. Jung described the animus as the archetype of meaning, and this is in line with Lacan's idea of the symbolic related to the appearance of the masculine principle, the father figure. The four characteristic phases in the development of the animus are the masculine as mere physical power, Hercules, the masculine as capable of action. Here the animus acquires greater independence and bigger intellectual professional development and the capacity for planned action. This is the hero, and it's Apollo. The masculine as bearer of the word, and in this transformation, is the word is the most important symbolic action, and the figure is the professor or clergyman. And finally, man as a spiritual guide. Here the animus is the incarnation of meaning and the mediator between the spiritual world and the real world, and between the conscious and the unconscious. And the figure is Hermes, Mercury, the messenger of the gods, also the guide to the underworld by means of dreams. Next, some quotations from Jung. The first one: the conscious side of woman corresponds to the emotional side of man, not to his mind. Mind makes up the soul, or better, the animus of woman. And just as the anima of a man consists of inferior relateness, full of effect, so the animus of woman consists of inferior judgment, or better, opinions. Second, for a woman, the typical danger emanating from the unconscious comes from above, from the spiritual sphere, personified by the animus, whereas for a man, it comes from the tonic realm of the world and woman. The anima is projected onto the world. And the third, unconscious assumptions or opinions are the worst enemy of woman. They can even grow into positively demonic passion that exasperates and disgusts men, and does the woman herself the greatest injury by gradually smothering the charm and meaning of her femininity and driving it into the background. Such a development naturally ends in profound psychological disunion, in short, in a neurosis. Regarding the situational archetypical images, we have, for example, the task. The hero is driven to complete some duty, often of huge proportions. For example, Frodo in keeping the ring safe in The Lord of the Rings. The quest. Here, the hero is searching for something, whether consciously or unconsciously, and when the symbolic object is found and brought back, it restores order and saves a previous wasteland from desolation, illness, and death. Another example is Beowulf. The initiation. In here, the hero or heroine is brought into another sphere of influence, usually into adulthood, and the whole narration is a rite of passage. An example is Alice in Wonderland. Death and rebirth. This grows out of parallels between the cycle of nature and the cycle of life. And for example, we have like springtime representing birth, youth, or sometimes rebirth. Evening, winter suggesting old age or death. The fall describes a descent from a higher to a lower state of being, and so on. The experience may involve defilement, or a loss of innocence as well. Death is also accompanied by expulsion from a kind of paradise as a penalty for disobedience and moral transgression. And finally, we also have another situation, which is the battle between good and evil, which are the two primal forces. Archetypes are also facets of a hero's personality. They bring together the divided self, and the whole process is about achieving wholeness and perfection. The hero is someone who is willing to sacrifice his own needs on behalf of others, and it represents the ego's search for wholeness. The psychological task we face is to integrate the separate parts into one complete balanced entity. And we also have the figure of the mentor. This is the wise old man or woman who teaches and protects the hero and gives him her supernatural aid. The threshold guardians represent the obstacles the hero faces. At a psychological level, they stand for internal demons, neuroses, emotional scars, vices, dependencies, and all kinds of self-limitations that hold back growth and progress. We also have the figure of the herald, or the mediator, who announces the need for change, gives a wake-up call, which could appear in a dream, in an incident, a person, it could be a new idea, etc. We have the figure of the hermaphrodite, both male and female, which represents the union of opposites and relationship mainly. The shapeshifter, who is elusive and changes moods and shapes and expresses psychic energy in general. The trickster, which embodies the energies of mischief and also desire for change. And for example, just to give an example, in Norse mythology, many of the gods' adventures originate some trick played by the half-god Loki. And finally, we have the higher self, which represents the divine within us. Jung believed that psychic energy was the energy by which the work of personality was performed, and that it originated from the metabolic processes of the body. He also believed that it found expression in actual forces like wishing, willing, feeling, striving, and potential forces, dispositions, attitudes, tendencies, inclinations. It follows principles of equivalence, energy expended to bring about a condition which appears elsewhere in the system, and entropy, the distribution of psychic energy, seeks an equilibrium or balance. This is the final self. Psychic energy performs the work necessary to maintain life and propagate the species, and also holds instinctual functions. Its excess can be diverted to cultural and spiritual activities. For example, developing higher purposes in life, like for example volunteering an organization, and also in doing artistic work and anything to do with creativity. Jung suggested that not only do the archetypal structures govern the behavior of all living organisms, but that they were contiguous with the structures controlling the behavior of inorganic matter as well. So he used the term Unus Mundus to describe the unitary reality which he believed underlaid all manifest phenomena. He conceived archetypes to be the mediators of the Unus Mundus, organizing not only ideas in the psyche, but also the fundamental principles of matter and energy in the physical world. Jung drew an analogy between the psyche and light on the electromagnetic spectrum. The center of the visible light spectrum, the yellow, corresponds to consciousness, which grades into unconsciousness at the red and blue ends. red corresponds to basic unconscious urges, and the invisible infrared end of the spectrum corresponds to the influence of biological instincts, which merge with chemical and physical conditions. The blue end of the spectrum represents spiritual ideas and archetypes, asserting their influence from beyond the visible and correspond to the invisible realm of the ultraviolet. The similarities between Jung's ideas and previous as well as contemporary explorations in electromagnetism, for example Tesla's work, etc., are quite interesting. For example, from this point of view, one could explore works such as Ita Hoffmann, Der Magnetiseur from 1814. The following is a quote from Jung. Just as a psychic infrared, the biological instinctual psyche gradually passes over into the physiology of the organism and thus merges with its chemical and physical conditions, so the psychic ultraviolet, the archetype, describes a field which exhibits none of the peculiarities of the physiological, and yet in the last analysis can no longer be regarded as psychic, although it manifests itself psychically. Jung's ideas about the paranormal culminated in his theory of synchronicity, the idea that meaningful connections in the world manifest through coincidence with no apparent causal link. What he referred to as a causal connecting principle. A quotation from Jung says that causality is only one principle and psychology essentially cannot be exhausted by causal methods, only because the mind, psyche, lives by aims as well. Jung influenced one philosophical interpretation of quantum physics with the concept of synchronicity regarding some events as non-causal. Despite his own experiments failing to confirm the phenomenon, he held on to the idea as an explanation for the apparent extrasensorial perception, ESP. And another quotation from Jung, "It is impossible, with our present resources, to explain ESP, or the fact of meaningful coincidence, as a phenomenon of energy. This makes an end of the causal explanation as well, for effect cannot be understood as anything except a phenomenon of energy. Therefore, it cannot be a question of cause and effect, but of a falling together in time, a kind of simultaneity. Because of this quality of simultaneity, I have picked on the term synchronicity to designate a hypothetical factor equal in rank to causality as a principle of explanation." Synchronicity is described as a governing dynamic which underlines the whole of human experience and history, social, emotional, psychological, and spiritual. Following discussions with Albert Einstein and Wolfgang Pauli, Jung believed that there were parallels between synchronicity and aspects of relativity theory and quantum mechanics. He believed that life was not a series of random events, but rather an expression of a deeper order, which he and Pauli referred to as Unus Mundus. Jung's insight into archetypes were also heavily influenced by the Book of the Dead, coming from Egyptian and Tibetan traditions. One interesting thing for you to research is, for example, Edgar Allan Poe's story The Gold Bag, which connects in interesting ways with Jung's theory of synchronicity. In Egyptian mythology, Khepri, he who comes to be, is depicted as a golden beetle or scarab and represents the goal of the rising morning. The sun, Ra, is the midday sun, also depicted as a human with a beetle on its head. Khepri rolls like a ball along the sky in a similar way to the beetle rolling a ball of dung and laying eggs in it after being dropped into a hole. Newborn beetles would emerge as if coming to be by themselves. Kepri also had this attribute of self-generation and self-renewal. The following quote from Jung refers to a dream of one of his patients regarding a bug, regarding a kind of beetle. A young woman I was treating had, at a critical moment, a dream in which she was given a golden scarab. While she was telling me this dream, I sat with my back to the closed window. Suddenly, I heard a noise behind me, like a gentle tapping. I turned around and saw a flying insect knocking against the window pane from the outside. I opened the window and caught the creature in the air as it flew in. It was the nearest analogy to a golden scarab one finds in our latitudes. A beetle, the common rose chaffer, which, contrary to its usual habits, had evidently felt the urge to get into a dark room at this particular moment. I must admit that nothing like this ever happened to me before or since. In 1937, after extensive traveling in the United Kingdom, the United States, and Africa, Jung left Zurich again for an extensive tour of India. Indian symbolism became an important element in his philosophy. In 1943, he became full professor of medical psychology at the University of Basel, but resigned after a year due to health problems. The following year, he published Psychology and Alchemy, in which he analyzed the alchemical symbols and argued that alchemical processes were the transformation of the impure soul to perfect soul, and a metaphor for the individuation process. Some years later, in 1959, he published Flying Saucers, a Modern Myth of Things Seen in the Skies. In 1961, Jung wrote his last work, a contribution to Man and His Symbols, entitled Approaching the Unconscious, which was published posthumously in 1964. In 1963, he published Mysterium Conjunctoris, and it was part of the collected works. It was his last book and focused on the Mysterium Conjunctoris archetype, known as the sacred marriage between sun and moon. Jung argued that the stages of the alchemist, the blackening, the whitening, the reddening, and the yellowing, could be taken as symbolic of individuation. In 1913, at the age of 38, Jung had experienced visions and heard voices. He became worried of developing psychosis, and he recorded everything he felt in small journals. He began to transcribe his notes into a large red leather-bound book, on which he worked intermittently for 16 years. He called it Liber Novus, or Red Book. It was not published until 2008. Two-thirds of the pages bear Jung's illustrations of the text. The following is one of the quotations. When I comprehended my darkness, a truly magnificent night came over me, and my dream plunged me into the depths of the millennia, and Rome my phoenix ascended. Mythologist Joseph Campbell expanded the definition of archetype to include stock characters, personality types, and other behavior patterns. For example, one of such is the serpent or hybrid dragon, which represents life. In ancient pre-Christian religions, the serpent dragon is not an evil character, but the representation of life and rebirth. Physically, it contains both the male, phallic, and female, water, attributes. So it represents a unified duality and also synchronicity in Jungian terms. The serpent dragon is usually an intermediary, a mediator that stands for change. In the Genesis story, The serpent is the point of departure from paradise, the cause of Adam and Eve's expulsion. In Greek mythology, Hermes, the messenger of the gods, usually carries a caduceus or herald's wand, entwined with two serpents. In the face of change, humans usually experience fear. Change is also suggested by the serpent, an animal that sheds its skin and often eats it, re-emerging as a new creature, born or reborn again. In ancient traditions, demons were always intermediaries between worlds, often messengers carrying information from the divine to the earthly side. The term comes from Greek and it was later shortened to mean demon, understood as a middleman or a go-between. In the Genesis account, the serpent is the dark force that helps Adam and Eve understand the world of God, since it gives them access to the secret and sacred knowledge of the tree of life through the story of the apple. This excess of knowledge bridges the sacred and the profane, and we will see more about this distinction when we study Misha Eliade in the next video. But also creates problems for the couple, as it does also in the myth of Faust, in both Marlowe and Goethe's accounts. As in ancient Mesopotamia, in the Egyptian, Buddhist, Greek, Celtic, and Nordic traditions, the crossing of boundaries is usually represented by a river. In some accounts, the enlightened human, for example Buddha, Siddhartha, is escorted across the river by an old ferryman. The ferryman stands for the intermediary, the mediator between worlds. He serves as a catalyst to Siddhartha's spiritual journey. In the Greek tradition, Hermes, like Dionysus or Orpheus, are psychopomp figures. They escort newly deceased souls from earth to the afterlife, usually in the underworld. The following is another quote from Jung. I saw you, O daimon, at the noonday hour, when the sun stood highest, you stood speaking with a blue shade, blood stuck to its forehead, and sullen torment darkened it. Duality expresses the idea that existence can be simultaneously one and multiple, and that life is a continuous process of change where all life attributes shift from one state to another, becoming not opposite but complementary partners. The Jungian persona and the shadow are not opposite parts of the ego. They are complementary pairs. Both exist in their relationship. They need each other. Traditional examples of duality are on and off, yes and no, order and chaos, good and bad, angel and demon, day and night, water and fire, life and death, young and old, self and others, man and woman, sun, moon, active, passive, giving, receiving, success, failure, firm, yielding, clarity, confusion. Shapes that express the forces of regeneration, multiplicity in unity, past, present, future in an instant are, for example, the circle and the sphere, the mandala, the yin-yang, the Ouroboros, the egg, the tree of life. The yin-yang is the symbol of Taoism and represents the interaction between opposing forces. It's a symbol that represents also perpetual motion and change. In mythological creation myths, there are usually opposing principles such as chaos and order that accompany creation. The yin-yang has two sides, a dark side and a light side, within a circle boundary. Each side contains a tiny speck of the other side's substance, demonstrating the interconnectivity between both sides. The yang is known as the male force, while the yin represents the female force. These forces do not have human attributes, but natural ones. In other words, although they are often represented as male versus female, man versus woman, they refer to more abstract entities that form part of a unity, that is, the idea of God. In psychological terms, Jungian concepts such as the anima and the animus represent the tiny specks within the yin-yang serpent or sperm-like form. The idea of God as life and also as love is captured in the depiction of the unification of complementary pairs, as a simple illustration of the simultaneous existence of multiplicity in the one. In Jungian terms, we talk of synchronicity. Sometimes the number 3 is also used. The cosmic tree of life captures the idea of the simultaneity of 3 kinds of time: present, past, and future. The following poem by Percy B. Shelley is a simple illustration of the circle of life archetype. The fountains mingle with the river, and the rivers with the ocean. The winds of heaven mix forever with the sweet emotion. Nothing in the world is single. All things by a law divine in one spirit meet and mingle. Why not I with thine? See the mountains kiss high heaven, and the waves clasp one another. No sister flower would be forgiven if it disdain its brother. And the sunlight claps the earth, and the moonbeams kiss the sea. What is all this sweet work worth if thou kiss not me? As mentioned at the beginning of this lecture, Joseph Campbell went on to expand Jung's theories and develop the notion of the monomyth. Campbell was professor of literature at Sarah Lawrence College in the United States, and he worked in comparative mythology and comparative religion. He gained popular recognition after George Lucas credited him as an influence in the Star Wars trilogy. Dan Brown was also inspired to create the character of Robert Langdon in the Da Vinci Code. In the 1920s, Campbell had studied at Columbia University, and he went on a trip to Europe and encountered a guru from the Theosophical Society. From then on, he became interested in India and in Indian philosophy. He gave up his work and pursued independent study in the early 30s. In 1932, he traveled to California, where he met writer John Steinbeck and his wife, and they developed a friendship. In 1934, he accepted a position as professor of literature at Sarah Lawrence College in New York, and 4 years later, he got married to one of his former students, the dancer and choreographer Jean Erdman. They lived in New York, in Greenwich Village, for almost 50 years. In 1955 and 56, Campbell took a sabbatical and traveled widely in Asia, mostly in India. He then felt the necessity to teach comparative mythology to a larger, non-academic audience, and went on to work on his famous publications. He died of cancer in 1987. In one of his books, The Masks of God, Creative Mythology, Campbell explains the functions of myths, and he indicates that they have a metaphysical function, for they awake a sense of awe and before a transcendent reality and the mystery of being. This mystery cannot be captured directly in a perceptual and representational form. It only appears in myths. So, according to Campbell, mythological symbols touch and accelerate centers of life beyond the reach of reason and coercion. The first function of mythology is to reconcile waking consciousness to the mysterium tremendum et fascinans of the universe as it is. Myths also have a sociological function, which is to validate and enforce social order, often describing how order arrived from divine intervention. And Campbell believed that the abilities for order, logic, and linearity came from the brain's left hemisphere, conforming to what he called the right-hand path. He also observed the existence of the left-hand path as a revolutionary character, surpassing certain norms because of his inner vision. And finally, according to Campbell, myths have a pedagogical function because some of them guide through stages of life. In his 1949 study entitled The Hero of a Thousand Faces, Campbell discusses his theory of the journey and the archetypal hero, which is an archetype shared by all world mythologies, according to Campbell. He termed this the quest or the monomyth. Campbell was influenced by different writers, for example, James Joyce, Thomas Mann, as well as by philosophers such as Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, Freud, and in particular, of course, Carl Jung. The concept of the monomyth, or one myth, refers to the theory that contemplates all mythic narratives as variations of a single great story. The theory is based on the observation that a common pattern exists beneath the narrative elements of most great myths, regardless of their origin or time of creation. An enthusiast of James Joyce, Campbell borrowed the term monomyth from Joyce's Finnegan's Wake, which was published in 1937, 12 years before his own volume. The basic structure can be classified using the various stages of a hero. First of all, the hero receives the call. Then the hero first refuses the call and prefers to stay in his comfort zone. But then he encounters the mentor or sage who enlightens him, and he finally crosses the threshold. He then experiences life-changing events, many difficulties, trials, and failures. He meets figures who help him, but also others who trick him. He ultimately faces the final trial, fighting a monster, a dragon, or something like this. In the course of these events, the hero has acquired new skills and sometimes has received supernatural aids, like revelation. After the ultimate battle with the dark forces is fought, the hero is rewarded. And in order to make amends for his errors, atonement, the hero returns to share his wisdom and help his people. The narrative also includes different journey motifs, such as the quest, the descent into hell, a heavenly ascent, a labyrinth, etc. If you would like to have more information, for example, about the labyrinth archetype, you can watch another one of my videos which deals with this topic specifically. There are 12 core archetypes, and depending on them, the hero can be one of those. For example, if he is the innocent, the archetype represents security, acceptance, disillusionment, and optimism. The shadow, at the same time, represents denial, repression, and blame. If the hero is an orphan, the archetype represents abandonment, accepting help, fight against authority, and the shadow equals cynicism, victimization sometimes, and so on. If we're talking about the hero warrior, the archetype is fighting for himself or herself or for others, and also for ideals. And the shadow represents ruthlessness and fighting to win. And if the hero is the caregiver, The archetype has to be self-sacrificing. It can also represent responsibility, and the shadow will be the dark side of martyrdom and guilt-inducing. In the course of the journey, the hero becomes a better person, and then for example, he may be the seeker, who is the archetype is exploring, experimenting, and the shadow is too much, too perfectionist, or an inability to commit. He can also be the destroyer. In this case, the archetype is confusion, acceptance of chaos, and letting go, and the shadow is the destructiveness of self and others. He can also be the lover, and in this case, the archetype is bonding, committing, and the shadow is envy, fixation, or, for example, Don Juanism as well. Or finally, he can be the creator. In this case, the archetype is the visionary, the creator of his own environment, and the shadow is creators in negative situations. For example, the story of Frankenstein. Regarding settings, we have many archetypal settings. For example, the crossroads, which are locations that encourage the setting of priorities and the making of important decisions. And this, for example, an example is The Wizard of Oz by Frank Baum. The underworld, which is a place where the hero encounters extreme fear and death. And an example is Dante's Inferno, or also the myth of Orpheus. Another setting is the maze and the labyrinth, which both represent uncertainty or a dilemma, a riddle that the hero has to solve before continuing his journey, and he gains greater inner vision. And one example is the movie Pan's Labyrinth. Another setting is the castle or mansion, which is normally a place of safety, represents sometimes it can be bewitched or enchanted, and sometimes it holds a treasure. And in pre-feminist times, it could also hold a beautiful princess. One example is Frank Kafka's The Castle. Another setting is the river, water in general. It represents the stages of life, but it also represents a boundary place between dimensions. The myth of the river of the ferryman in the Egyptian and Tibetan books of the dead is one example. The Iceland represents isolation in order to pursue meditation and enlightenment, and a typical example is Defoe's Robinson Crusoe. The garden is an earthly paradise, a place of love and fertility, and the example is the Garden of Eden, and also in Greek mythology, the Garden of Hesperides. The forest is a place of wilderness, unconscious desires, uncontrollable irrationality, as in Shakespeare's Midsummer's Night Dream. The mountain represents obstacles, and when they are surmounted, the hero gets additional capabilities. One example is the Puritan narrative of John Bunyan, Pilgrim's Progress. The Tree of Life, it's an axis mundi that connects worlds and stands for synchronicity, unifying past, present, and future. Finally, the wasteland or desert is a barren place that creates difficulties from which the hero emerges stronger, as in T.S. Eliot poem. Finally, we have come to the end of this very long lecture. I just want to mention that in 1990, Maureen Murdoch, a Jungian psychotherapist and student of Joseph Campbell, published The Heroine's Journey, providing a feminist reading of Campbell's model. So this is also an interesting book to read and explore if you want to see the variations provided by a feminist reader of Campbell's monomyth. Thank you very much for joining me in today's lecture, and I hope you join me in part 3, where we will finish with myth criticism, exploring the work of Sir James Frazer, Norton Fry, and also Misha Eliade.